If you told me that a missing person report could begin with a spoonful of roasted duck in orange glaze, I'd have laughed you out of the brownstone. But that was before the man invited to dinner didn't show up and before Wolfe stared at the empty chair longer than he stared at the duck, which in our house is something close to a biblical event. It started around 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, when Fritz was polishing silver, and Wolfe was reciting a list of ingredients for a new sauce that, in his words, ought to humble the Bordelaise. I was at my desk, filing expense reports with the enthusiasm of a man preparing for a dental procedure. When the phone rang, Wolfe grunted, which in Wolfine translates to Goodwin, answer it. But if it's Kramer, hang up. The voice on the other end was deep, crisp, and far too polite. Said his name was Thomas Broadel, and that he had an invitation. Not a problem, not a case, but an invitation for Mr. Wolfe and myself to join him for a private dinner. Wolfe doesn't do invitations. If the Pope himself offered him a seat at the Vatican buffet, Wolfe would send regrets and ask for the menu. But Broadel didn't want Wolfe to come to him, he wanted to come here. He said he had a favor to ask, but would only say it over roast duck and wine. A gift, he called it. Something Wolfe wouldn't want to miss. That's the kind of bait you don't dangle unless you know the fish is hungry. And Wolfe, though he denied it, was curious. You could tell from the way his eyelids didn't completely drop when I relayed the message. He let out a sigh that sounded like 1,000 paperweights settling onto his soul and nodded once. That was his version of rolling out the red carpet. Fritz nearly had a seizure. A dinner guest meant a revised menu, fresh napkins, and sacrificing a duck he'd been saving for Thursday. Wolfe dictated the changes with his usual tyranny, and by 6:45, the dining room looked ready for royalty. The place card with Thomas Broadel in elegant script sat across from Wolfe's place setting, like it had always belonged there. But at 7, there was no knock. At 7:10, no call. By 7:20, Wolfe had stopped buttering his second roll. At 7:30, he asked me to check the door again. I did. The stoop was empty, the sidewalk silent, and the street unvisited. Mr. Broadel, Wolfe said, has either lost his courage or misplaced his integrity, or maybe he just got hit by a cab. I offered. This is New York. Wolfe didn't dignify that with a reply. He stood, which alone should have triggered sirens, and walked into the front room. He looked out the window for all of 6 seconds, which, for Wolfe, is like a jog. Then he turned and muttered, "Archie, we are being baited." Now, in most houses, that sentence wouldn't mean much. But in the brownstone, baited is not a word Wolfe uses lightly. The man could eat insults like olives, but he didn't like games, especially ones played on his turf. And when a man promises an in-person favor and then doesn't show, it's not just a no-show, it's a statement. I checked the city directory. No Thomas Broadel. I ran his name through our contacts, bank records, even the address he gave over the phone. It was a commercial office downtown unoccupied. Wolfe told me to call Lon Cohen at the Gazette. Lon didn't have a Broadel either. No obituary, no criminal file, no marriage license, not even a weather report with his name on it. So we were left with an empty chair, a dead-end address. and a bottle of wine that suddenly tasted a lot less celebratory. Wolfe returned to the dining room around 8, stared at the untouched setting across from him, then ordered Fritz to clear it. When Fritz hesitated, Wolfe barked, "He is not coming. Remove it." After dinner, Wolfe lit a cigar and stared at the ceiling. I could hear the gears turning. He wasn't angry yet, but something had lodged in his brain and wasn't budging. He didn't like being made a part of a mystery he hadn't chosen, and he especially didn't like being observed. Without being able to observe back, "I'll go poke around," I said, grabbing my coat. "Want me to rattle a few ghosts?" "No," Wolfe said, eyes closed. "He will come again, not in person, but in consequence." I asked what he meant. Wolfe didn't answer. He simply reached for his beer and said, "Tomorrow, Archie, begin with the assumption that the man does not exist." And that was it. The curtain had lifted. The play hadn't started yet, but the audience, Wolfe, myself, and maybe a few shadows out there in the city, was already seated. The next morning began like any other. Fritz fussing with breakfast, Wolfe giving the eggs his traditional once-over before deeming them worthy, and me reading the paper in my robe, trying not to spill coffee on the crossword. You wouldn't know that the night before had ended with a phantom dinner guest and an ominous line about consequences. But that's Wolfe for you. He never hurries, even when the world tries to sprint past him. At 9:02, Wolfe told me to find Thomas Broddle again, this time with the gloves off. The first stop was Saul Panzer. If there was anyone who could trace a ghost through Manhattan with nothing but a breath and a bus transfer, it was Saul. I gave him the name, the voice description, the fake address, and the time of the call. Saul didn't blink, just nodded once and said, "Back to you by noon." Meanwhile, I headed down to the public records office. There's a certain kind of quiet desperation in those rooms, people looking for birth certificates, property disputes, and alibis they didn't know they needed. I flipped through employment rolls, business registries, lease agreements, even checked the state university alumni lists. Not a single Broddle, not even a Braddle, Brodin, or Brodsky that matched the voice and confidence of the man who'd phoned us. It was like someone had invented a man for the express purpose of standing us up. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had camped in the office, not doing his usual ritual of hiding behind a book on orchids. Instead, he sat in his oversized chair with no reading material and both hands tented in front of his mouth. That was Wolfe's version of pacing. He told Fritz to hold all calls and had Theo bring up a few newspaper files from the basement, older editions of the Gazette from the past 3 years. I peeked through the door just long enough to see headlines circled in red pencil, and Wolfe's eyes scanning with surgical patience. At 12:17, Saul called. Got something odd. He said, "Nobody by the name Broddle bought groceries, paid rent, or answered a phone in this city last week. But a guy using that name did reserve a table for 2 at Le Chandelier 2 nights ago, under a different number. I got the transcript from the Macta D. Voice matches your description. Only get this, he never showed, so he's building a record of no-shows." I said, "That's one hell of a resume." "That's not all," Saul continued. He also made a donation anonymously, but traceable to the Metropolitan Opera under the same alias. Again, no follow-up, no event attendance, just noise. Noise for who? I asked. That's the question. He's not hiding. He's being seen not showing up. When I relayed that to Wolfe, he closed the newspaper and murmured something about constructive absence. Then he told me to call on Cohen again. This time, Wolfe wanted a list not of men named Broadel, but of people recently accused or suspected of corporate espionage, embezzlement, or political backstabbing who had been publicly cleared. People whose sins, Wolfe said, have been washed without soap. Lon took 20 minutes to call back. Funny you should ask. There was a banking executive who got grilled in the press about a missing investor fund came out clean. There was also a museum trustee who got her hands slapped over a disputed acquisition. And a guy named Ronnie Vonek, a real estate lawyer who was suspected of sinking a deal from the inside, but walked away clean. Any of them use aliases? I asked. Lon hesitated. The Vonek guy. He's known to have played at being other people. For kicks, supposedly. Wolfe, upon hearing that, leaned forward an event worth marking on the calendar. Have Mr. Vonek brought here, he said, under pretext if necessary. Tell him we represent a client looking to purchase a block of midtown property and need legal counsel. That was my cue to stretch the truth until it made a sound. I called Vonek's office, posed as an assistant for a fictitious developer named David Halberd, and requested a consultation at Wolfe's Brownstone for 4 p.m. I used a new voice part Texas oil man, part nervous rookie, and apparently it worked. Because the secretary slotted us in now. Normally Wolfe avoids business entanglements that don't come with clear facts. But this wasn't about property or litigation. This was bait. Vonek may not have been Broadel, but Wolfe's hunch was sharpening into something more than irritation. He believed this man, if not the ghost, who had stood us up, was somehow standing just outside the spotlight, ready to either trip or testify. At precisely 3:58, the doorbell rang. Fritz opened it with his usual mix of cold grace and careful disdain. In stepped a man in a tan suit, slick hair, and a smile that could slice butter. Ronnie Vonek introduced himself with a handshake that lasted just too long and a glance that tried to absorb the room. I offered him a seat across from Wolfe. Wolfe didn't rise. He just flicked a finger to indicate the chair and said, "Mr. Vonek, thank you for coming. Let us dispense with the fiction. I am not in real estate." That wiped the smile. Vonek blinked, chuckled once, then looked at me. "So what is this? A setup? I get punked by a private eye and a gourmand?" "No," Wolfe replied. "You are not being mocked. You are being warned." And just like that, the air in the room turned a degree colder. Vonek didn't like being told he was being warned. It showed in the way he shifted his weight in the chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked from me to Wolfe like he was still deciding which one of us was bluffing. He had the kind of self-satisfied expression you usually see on corporate ladder climbers who think they've made it to the top without anyone noticing the knife in their hand. I dealt with enough of his type to know the routine say little, smirk often, and make sure nothing sticks when the questions start flying. I think you've mistaken me for someone else, he said smoothly, tugging at the cuffs of his shirt like the gesture alone could dismiss the whole conversation. But I'm curious, what exactly am I being warned about? Wolfe didn't look up from the notepad in his lap. He tapped the edge with his index finger once, as if marking a beat. A man who doesn't exist invited me to dinner. He did not rive. He also did not exist in any useful record. But he does appear to exist in intent. That sounds poetic. Von Eck said, "You want to run it by me again in English?" I leaned forward, mostly to give Wolfe the space to keep brooding. The guy used the name Thomas Broddle. He called us, invited Wolfe to dinner, said he had a favor to ask only face to face. Wolfe agreed, and for Wolfe, that's rare. But Broddle didn't show. Never showed at the restaurant he booked 2 nights earlier, either. Never showed to claim his Met Opera donation. He's a professional no-show. And you, Von Eck, have a history of using names that aren't yours. Von Eck smiled again, the kind of smile that looked like a warm-up before. He sued you for defamation. I've used aliases in private negotiations. That's not a crime. It's called discretion. Discretion is not invention, Wolfe said, finally raising his eyes. What interests me, Mr. Von Eck, is not your capacity to role-play, but your reason for doing so in my direction. You are not here because I invited you. You are here because I permitted your presence. There is a difference. Von Eck's smile thinned. And what makes you think I had anything to do with this? Broddle. Wolfe inhaled deeply, as if he needed the extra oxygen to tolerate the obvious. The alias fits your pattern. The timing fits your availability. And the intent this calculated absence suggests a signal was meant to be sent, not a meeting to be had. Von Eck uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. The move looked casual, but the tension was there. Let's assume you're right and someone's playing games. Maybe it's not about you. Maybe you're just a piece on someone else's board. If I am a piece, Wolfe replied, then I am the rook, immovable until I choose to act, and devastating once I do. That earned a low chuckle from Von Eck. All right, Mr. Wolfe, you've made your point. I didn't call you. I don't know who did. But if someone used my style, maybe they wanted your attention. Maybe you're already in the middle of something you haven't seen yet. That, Wolfe said, is precisely the point. I stood. Thanks for stopping by. Mr. Von Eck, we'll validate your parking. Oh, wait. We don't do that. He didn't move right away. His eyes lingered on Wolfe. Be careful who you invite to dinner, Mr. Wolfe, even when they don't show up. And with that, he left, not hurried, not nervous, just thoughtful, like a man who hadn't expected to be caught but wasn't, surprised to have been. Wolfe didn't speak for several minutes. He reached for a beer, took one sip, and then stared at the corner of the room where the globe sat. That meant he was thinking, and I didn't interrupt when he finally spoke. It was in that calm, clipped tone he reserves for his most serious assessments. That man knows who Broddle is, or was, I said, or never was, Wolfe corrected. Fiction may be the point, to summon my attention by means of absence, to introduce a phantom whose sole purpose is to lead me towards something or away from it. I nodded. So, what's our next move? You won't need to tail Vonnegut. No, Wolfe said. He's too practiced. He'll make you, instead, go to the Metropolitan Opera, speak to the donations clerk, obtain the envelope used to submit the contribution from Brothel. I assume it was physical. If not, find the bank account. That's one of Wolfe's little tricks. He assumes the flaw before the detail is confirmed. It gives you a head start. I headed down to the Met's administrative office, flashed enough charm and fox authority to get an intern to pull the record. The donation had indeed come by envelope, $500 in crisp bills, accompanied by a card that read, "For the quiet corners where sound matters most." TV creepy? Yes. Helpful? Possibly. The handwriting was smooth, angular, and slanted forward, like someone always in a rush. I took a photo and brought it back to Wolfe, who examined it like it was a bloodstain. Compare this to known samples of Vonnegut's hand, he said. He's been deposed. Find court records. Find contracts. Find checks. That sent me on a half-day crawl through legal archives, digital scans, and some extra help from Saul, who sent over to scan contracts with Vonnegut's signature and margin notes. Wolfe studied the samples with a magnifier. Then, in a rare move, he summoned me into the plant room. "Look at this," he said, holding both pieces side by side. The loop of the B, the length of the tail on the T, the upward stroke on the M in most. These are not identical, but they share character. You're saying Vonnegut wrote the Met note? I'm saying he didn't disguise it carefully enough. At that point, Wolfe didn't need to accuse Vonnegut. He only needed to understand why a man would pretend to be someone else to not meet with him. It was an invitation, not to dinner, but to engagement, a challenge, the kind Wolfe would never ignore. The next morning, while Wolfe dictated another letter to be sent under my name, this one to an art foundation connected to one of Vonnegut's recent clients, Fritz entered the office holding an envelope. It had been slipped under the front door sometime after sunrise. No stamp, no name. Inside was a folded page. On it, just one sentence. It was never about the dinner. It's about what you'll miss next. Wolfe took a long breath, folded the paper neatly, and set it beside the beer he hadn't touched. "So," he murmured, "the game insists on escalation." I turned toward the front door. "Want me to check the cameras? Check everything," Wolfe said, his voice suddenly sharper. "And Archie, watch your step. This is no longer a game of absence. It's a game of removal. Let me tell you something about envelopes slid under locked doors. They don't just deliver messages. They declare intentions. You want to scare a man like Nero Wolfe, you don't send threats. You send mysteries, half-statements, ghost footprints. And this particular message, it's about what you'll miss next, had the aroma of something sour, about to spoil. I spent the next 3 hours poring over footage from our entryway cam. It's tucked above the awning, angled to catch anyone approaching from the left or right. The file gave me for cigarette butts, a garbage truck, 2 joggers, and 1 delivery guy who tripped on our step, but no envelope dropper. Whoever did it approached at just the right blind spot and vanished just as fast. Either a coincidence or somebody who knew how to dance with our system. Wolfe didn't rant, didn't pace, didn't even sigh. But he sat in the office longer than usual that day, declining to take his mid-morning visit to the orchids. That's what worried me. When Wolfe breaks schedule, it means the air's changed. And it had. I checked in with Saul again to see if he could trace where Vonek had been. That morning, Saul came back with something odd. Vonek had been spotted entering a building in Midtown. That housed a legal archive, but he hadn't emerged for almost 2 hours. No appointment, no client meetings, just him poking around in a place you don't visit unless you're cleaning up a paper trail or digging up someone else's. So I paid the building a visit. The clerk on duty had no record of Vonek officially accessing anything. But a friendly janitor named Luis remembered a guy in a tan suit, asking questions about sealed arbitration files. He didn't get them. Those records don't open for anyone. Without a court order, but the attempt was noted. I phoned it into Wolfe, who grunted once and said, "He's trying to erase something. We must find it before it vanishes." The question, of course, was what? I turned over the phrase again in my mind. What you'll miss next. It wasn't about Wolfe's presence, it was about his absence, about something being taken or buried so quietly he wouldn't notice it until it was gone. That meant it wasn't a person. Not yet. It was a document, a record, a truth with a timestamp and an eraser beside it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe told me to bring up our old case files from 5 years ago. The ones involving property disputes, investment fraud, anything where Wolfe's conclusions had halted a public scandal. It was a mountain of paper, but Fritz and I managed to drag the boxes in from storage and pile them on the floor like academic corpses. Wolfe didn't touch them. He simply told me to start reading. Look for names that matched up with Vonek's legal clients. 3 hours in, I found it. A slim case. Barely remembered it at first. Wolfe had called it a nuisance. Back in 2018, a private art investor named Nero Wolfe had tried to reclaim ownership of a stolen painting, sold through a shady broker tied to a midtown law firm. Wolfe had uncovered that the sale had been staged, the theft faked, and the real painting had been swapped years prior. The twist: Wolfe never made the outcome public. The client didn't want exposure, just possession. So the file was thin, incomplete, and unremarkable to anyone not paying close attention. But there, buried in a footnote, was a name, Ronnie Vonek, legal liaison for the seller. When I showed Wolfe the page, his eyes narrowed. That's it. That's the nerve. You think Vonek's trying to bury this case? More likely, Wolfe said. Someone else is trying to exhume it, and Vonek is trying to stay ahead. That explained the pattern: the fake invitations, the Met donation, the no-show games. Wolfe wasn't the target. He was the detonator. Someone had needed to provoke him into revisiting a file that had almost disappeared. But why now? And why? So carefully, Saul called again that evening. With a new update. Nero Wolfe had died 2 weeks ago. Natural causes. No controversy. No police involvement. But the timing wasn't cozy. It was exact. 2 weeks dead, and now we get a fake guest at dinner. That wasn't coincidence, that was choreography. Wolfe stared out the window for a full minute before speaking. Someone wants the truth about that painting brought back into daylight, but only under controlled light. They do not want a new scandal, they want leverage. I didn't need a diagram to follow. The Costigan painting, once thought stolen and recovered under Wolfe's quiet guidance, was now worth more than its weight in diamonds. If it was ever proven that the painting still in Costigan's possession was the original, and that the legal transfer had been fraudulent, someone out there could either blackmail a museum, file a massive insurance claim, or crush the value of a rival collector's holdings, a financial nuke with a nice frame. And the only man who could prove or deny the real trail, Wolfe. At 7 p.m. Fritz announced that someone was at the door. Not a delivery man, not a neighbor, a woman, tall, 40-something, tailored coat, carrying a leather portfolio. She said her name was Delia Costigan, niece of the late Merrill Costigan. I brought her into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, but he did watch her with a level of attention usually reserved for rare orchids or badly cooked eggs. Mr. Wolfe, she began, placing the folder on his desk. I believe my uncle was murdered. I can't prove it, and I can't go to the police. But before he died, he gave me this and told me to find you if anything happened. Inside the folder was a single sheet of hotel stationery, scrawled in trembling ink. It's still the original. Tell Wolfe, don't let them switch it again. Delia's eyes didn't waver. Do you know what he meant? I do, Wolfe said softly. And so does Mr. Vonneck. She looked relieved. Then you'll help? I already am, he replied. She nodded. There's something else. My uncle said if anyone came asking about the painting before I spoke to you, I should lie. That someone would try to get to me first. Wolfe glanced at me. I didn't need to be told. We'll need a list of everyone who contacted you since his death. I said, anyone unusual, any invitations, especially ones that didn't happen. She paused. There was a man, he called, said he represented a foundation interested in acquiring the piece. Told me not to speak with any other advisors until we met. We arranged to meet at Le Chandelier, but he never showed. Wolfe exhaled. Softly, Thomas Broddle. Delia blinked. Yes, that was the name. I felt my spine straighten. The no-show game had been played on her, too, and probably others. Whoever this was, whatever organization or individual behind Broddle, they were throwing shadows in every direction. And now Wolfe had stepped into the light. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, contact Inspector Kramer. Request a private audience. Tell him we are no longer speculating, we are now pursuing. I raised a brow. We're involving Kramer now. He won't like it, Wolfe said, but he'll come. Because when this story breaks, he'll want his name attached to the front end. And just like that, the brownstone became a chessboard. Inspector Kramer doesn't like Nero Wolfe. That's not a secret. What's less obvious is that the feeling is mutual. Though Wolfe disguises it under a thick crust of grammatical precision and culinary disdain, still, for all their philosophical warfare. When the stakes are high and the fog gets thick, Kramer listens eventually. And on this particular morning, when I called and told him we had a problem involving forged art, a fabricated identity, and a potentially fraudulent legal history tied to a dead man's warning, I could hear the pause through the line like it owed me money. "I'll give you 20 minutes, Kramer grunted. "You better make it worth the trip." That was his way of saying, "I'm already on my way." By the time he arrived, Wolfe was already seated in his office, the windows cracked. The temperature raised exactly 3 degrees from the norm, his version of rolling out a red carpet. Fritz brewed coffee, but Wolfe didn't offer any. That was a negotiation tactic. Kramer knew it, and he scowled accordingly. He entered with his usual flair, wrinkled raincoat, cigar jammed between his teeth, and a folder under his arm like it had committed a felony. He nodded to me, grunted at Wolfe, and planted himself in the red chair like it had insulted him personally. "Let's have it," he barked. Wolfe gestured toward the folder. I'd prepped a collection of all relevant notes. The brothel, invitations, the donation slip, the painting file, and the note from Merrill Costigan's niece. Kramer flipped through it like a man expecting a prank. Then he saw the note from Merrill and frowned. "You're telling me this guy Costigan died 2 weeks ago, and now you've got someone impersonating donors and skipping dinner reservations just to get your attention?" Wolfe nodded. "It appears I was baited into re-examining a case someone preferred stayed dormant." Kramer scratched his chin. "You reported the painting as recovered back in 2018. Quietly. I remember you refused to make a public statement. The client requested discretion," Wolfe said. "I honored it. But now someone believes that peace has more value as a lie than it ever did as art." Kramer leaned forward. "You think someone switched it back then? Or is it still the original?" Wolfe sighed. "It was the original when I last confirmed it. But if a switch occurred after my involvement, I cannot confirm that without re-examination. And who benefits if it's not the original anymore?" "Everyone who stood to lose from the first recovery," I said. "Or anyone with stakes in the insurance, the provenance, or even Costigan's estate, including, potentially, the lawyers involved." Kramer pulled out a pad. "You mentioned a name, Ronnie Vonek. He called himself Thomas Broddle when he tried to bait Wolfe," I said. "At least twice. He's good at shadows, never commits, always hovers. And he's already tried to access court records tied to the original dispute." Kramer looked at Wolfe. "You got anything that would stick?" "No," Wolfe said. "Not yet. But I believe he is at the nexus." "What about the niece?" Kramer asked. "This Delia. She's clean," I said. "She came to us because her uncle told her to. Gave her a note. She's been approached by Broddle to same no-show routine." Kramer rubbed his temple. "Jesus. Okay. So what do you want from me?" "A list," Wolfe said. "Any active investigations involving stolen art, fraudulent asset transfers, or death benefits linked to Costigan's holdings. Quiet ones. The ones you haven't put in your reports yet," Kramer grumbled. "You think I just carry those around?" "No," Wolfe said. "But you'll obtain them, because if you don't, I will. And if I do, I'll have to use methods you later disapprove of publicly while benefiting from privately. Kramer snorted. You think you're clever. I think I'm patient, Wolfe replied. That makes me dangerous. That seemed to do it. Kramer stood, shoved his cigar back between his teeth, and mumbled, I'll get you what I can. He left without saying goodbye, which meant he was actually going to help. After he was gone, Wolfe returned to silence. That wasn't unusual, but he didn't dictate letters, didn't open his book, didn't call for beer. He just sat, steepling his fingers. That meant he was thinking through more than the facts. He was pulling at threads only he could feel. I gave him an hour, then asked, What's still missing? A mechanism, he said. We know the motive control. We suspect the method identity obfuscation. But we lack the mechanism. For what? For how the switch, if it happened, was facilitated without documentation. Someone rearranged something. I want to know what. That's when it hit me. Something had been tampered with quietly, without much notice. Wolfe's theory wasn't just about forged names or misdirected meetings. It was about records, legal ones, and possibly one that had gone missing. I grabbed the Merrill Costigan file again and flipped through the copied correspondences. Back in 2018, there had been a document sent to Wolfe by the original broker signed and notarized that had claimed the painting was being returned voluntarily. Wolfe had cross-examined it, verified its authenticity, then closed the file. But now, that page was gone. Wolfe, I said, holding the folder open. Remember the notarized statement from the broker? The one that included the chain of custody. Details? Yes, it's not here. Wolfe looked up, then reached for the file. He scanned it, his lips compressed. It was here 2 months ago, he said. I scanned it myself, I said. You annotated the margins. I remember the blue pencil. That file has not left this house. But the page is missing. Double quotes silence. Fritz, when questioned, confirmed no one had touched the storage. Theo said no documents had been borrowed. There had been no service calls, no reorganizations, no cleaning beyond the usual dusting. That left one possibility. Someone came in, I said, slipped under our radar during a delivery or one of Fritz's grocery runs, and took only what they needed. Wolfe nodded slowly. That is the trespass. It fit. A deliberate, precise theft, not of an object, but of evidence. Something that could later be cited, disputed, denied. Without the notarized document, the timeline of ownership could be challenged. And someone wanted it that way. Wolfe stood and walked to the safe. He opened it. Inside, among rare wines and sensitive correspondence, was a secondary copy of the Costigan case file, Wolfe's own annotated archive. He pulled it out, opened it, and let out a quiet breath. Still here, he said, holding up the blue-penciled document. They took the office copy, but not the original. I exhaled. So we still have proof. Yes, but so does the thief. Proof that we know. It was a message. We've reached you. We can take things. We can leave silence where truth once sat. That evening, Delia returned with news. A man claiming to be from the insurance company had called to arrange an appraisal of the painting at her place. She hadn't agreed, per Wolfe's instruction. But the man had insisted. He was coming tomorrow at noon. Wolfe nodded. "We shall be ready." "How?" she asked. "We'll host another dinner," he said. "And this time, our guest will be expected. We didn't set the table that night, Fritz did. But we watched every movement, every place setting, every pour. It wasn't just a dinner, it was bait, carefully arranged cutlery, chilled burgundy. A modest but unmistakably authentic Florentine roast, each element a quiet dare. A declaration of order. Nero Wolfe had decided to reset the trap. This time knowing it was a trap. And I, yours truly, got to play Macta D, bodyguard and net. Delia Costigan sat at the far end of the dining room table in a dark green dress. Composed but tense, Wolfe, of course, took his usual seat at the head of the table, his bulk positioned squarely under the chandelier, like a sphinx under a floodlight. I had prepped the room, double-checked the hallway cameras, and positioned myself where I could intercept anyone who decided to add poison to the soup or pull a disappearing act through the pantry. Call me paranoid, but we'd had one too many. Guests who liked to leave through back doors or windows. At 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the appointment hour, doorbell rang. Fritz, ever the silent butler, opened it. And there he was. Same tan suit, same confident smile, same voice. "I'm here on behalf of Archangel Insurance," the man said. "Appraisal division for Miss Costigan." Fritz gave him the kind of nod that could sterilize fruit, then showed him in. I stood in the hallway, arms crossed. "You're early," I said. The man didn't flinch. "Punctuality's a dying art." "No, murder is the dying art. Punctuality just takes discipline." That got the faintest smirk. "Shall we proceed?" "In a moment," I said. "Let's go over credentials." He reached into his coat, produced a folder with a business card clipped to the top, and handed it to me. The card read Matthew Grover, Appraisals Division, Archangel Insurance. The name was different, but the handwriting on the business card block print, sharp strokes looked suspiciously like the note signed by TB. At the Met, the rest of the folder was fluff. No formal documentation, no digital ID, no business license. "You always work analog?" I asked. "Sensitive clients prefer paper. Do they also prefer aliases?" He smiled again, no teeth. "This time, I'd like to see the painting." "Of course you would," I said. "Follow me." He walked into the dining room, and the second his eyes landed on Wolfe, the air shifted. The man Grover, Brodel, whoever paused. Only a second. But I saw it. Recognition, not surprise. More like acknowledgement. Wolfe gestured to the empty seat across from him. The man sat down. "I thought this was an appraisal." "It is," Wolfe said. "An appraisal of intent." Delia remained silent, hands folded in her lap. I stood by the door, arms still crossed. Fritz poured wine. The man didn't drink. "I've made an error," Wolfe began, "in assuming the purpose of your first invitation. I believed you meant to provoke my curiosity. But that was only a pretext." The man tilted his head. "And what do you believe now?" That you intended to create a pattern, Wolfe said. To establish a presence through absence. To remind your targets you exist. You left just enough breadcrumbs to suggest urgency, but not enough to reveal source. Until now, the man leaned forward. You think I'm Thomas Brodel. I think you're a man who answers to whatever name suits the moment. But yes, you were Brodel at least twice. The man didn't confirm or deny, just studied Wolfe. Like a student watching a lecturer he couldn't decide whether to admire or replace. What is it you want? Wolfe asked. I'm here for the painting. No, you're here for what the painting represents, Wolfe corrected. Power, leverage, the means to devalue a rival's collection or to inflate a false provenance. The painting is a key. You want the lock it opens. The man turned to Delia. May I speak with Miss Costigan directly? You may not, Wolfe said. She is a guest in my house. You are an interloper. That got the first real reaction. A blink, followed by a long, shallow breath. You're interfering with a matter of private ownership. He said. I'm interfering, Wolfe said, with subterfuge. The painting is not yours, nor is the claim. You are not representing Archangel Insurance. You are not Matthew Grover. And if I were to test your fingerprints against the invitation letter you left on my stoop, I would find a match, the man's. Jaw tightened. That would be inadmissible. That would be sufficient, Wolfe said, for Kramer to start asking you uncomfortable questions. I stepped forward. In fact, he's already asked a few. Your name came up last week in connection with an unrelated fraud case. He's keeping a file. Still, the man didn't blink. You have no proof. Wolfe nodded. No, I don't. But I do have possession of the original notarized custody document for the Costigan painting. The one you removed from this house 2 nights ago. I have a second copy. The true copy. Your theft was incomplete. That did it. The man stood to quickly. I have no further business here. I moved in front of the door. Sit down. His hand twitched near his coat pocket, and I stepped closer. Empty it, I said. He didn't move. Wolfe's voice dropped. Mr. Goodwin is not inclined to shoot, but he is not unprepared. The man slowly removed a small recording device audio only and set it on the table. Wolfe glanced at it. So that's how you built your file. You baited, recorded, compiled. Evidence is persuasive. The man said, evidence is fragile. Wolfe replied, especially when it lacks consent. Delia stood. Get out. He turned to her. Something flickering in his expression, not fear, not shame, just calculation. She had seen it too. That part of him that spoke in codes, in layers. But he had lost the game, and he knew it. He stepped past me, straightened his lapels, and walked out the front door without a word. I shut it behind him. Wolfe remained seated. Delia sat down again, her hands shaking slightly. You think he'll come back? She asked. No, Wolfe said. His role is complete. He was never meant to claim the painting only to shake the branches and see what fell. What does that mean for me? It means you're now the target of silence. You won't be approached again. Not directly, but offers may appear. Legal inquiries, new buyers, all cloaked, all clean. Decline them. Delia nodded. And the painting? Wolfe looked at me. Archie, you will escort Miss Costigan and the painting to the Metropolitan Art Security Registry tomorrow morning. It will be appraised, logged, and sealed. She will retain ownership, but not vulnerability. You got it. Delia stood again. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. He nodded. The man who did not come to dinner has now been served. She smiled faintly and left. Wolfe turned to Fritz, there, and to me. Prepare for the office gathering. I believe we've earned it. Wolfe doesn't like people in his house, certainly not more than 2 at a time. And never more than 1 at a time unless someone's dead, missing, or morally unpleasant. But when the gears start clicking, when the patterns are lying in that fat, unforgiving brain of his, he calls for what we call the office gathering. You've probably seen movies where detectives pull everyone into the drawing room and announce who the killer is. Well, this is Wolfe's version minus the theatrics, plus a gallon of verbal precision and a room full of suspects itching to be anywhere else. This one was scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp. Wolfe made the calls himself technically. I made them, but only after he dictated them with enough emphasis to make the typewriter wince. Each invitation was worded exactly the same. Mr. Wolfe requests your presence at 6 p.m. regarding the Costigan estate, the Costigan painting, and any legal or commercial affiliations therein. Attendance is advisable. The phrasing was important. Requests instead of demands, advisable instead of mandatory. Wolfe knew which words drew people like moths and which ones sent them looking for lawyers. The list included Delia Costigan, of course, Roni Vonnegut, the likeliest spider in the web, Nigel Bostwick, an art appraiser with ties to Archangel. Insurance, Susan Dart, director of the Horizon Arts Fund, where Costigan once served as a donor, and Frederick Baum, Costigan's former personal attorney, and a man who could look innocent while breaking into a vault. I had Fritz prepare the chairs 5 in a row facing Wolfe's desk, plus mine slightly angled. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain contemplating weather. He had his yellow notepad, a Mont Blanc pen, and an unopened bottle of brown beer. He wasn't speaking yet. He was waiting for them to see him first. Delia was the first to arrive. She wore a dark blazer and jeans, trying to look casual, but her eyes were sharp and unreadable. I led her to the first chair. She sat with her arms crossed. Next came Vonnegut. Tan suit again, he must buy them by the crate. He gave me a smug little nod, then froze when he saw Delia. Interesting guest list. He said to no one in particular. Bostwick arrived third, weary, balding, with a mustache that twitched every time he breathed. He smelled like books and something slightly acidic, like vinegar and ego. I assumed this would be private, he muttered. It is, I said. Just a small group of people with overlapping lies. Then came Susan Dart. She swept in like. She was late to an art gala, loud necklace, louder heels, and a notepad the size of a placemat. She didn't speak to anyone, just took her seat and began scribbling notes before Wolfe had even blinked. Baum was last. Tall, dry, and annoyed. He stepped into the office with the energy of a man summoned to jury duty by a rival. He looked down, took the remaining chair, and cleared his throat in that way lawyers do when they want everyone to know they're preparing to object. Once the door clicked shut, Wolfe finally lifted his gaze. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "And thank you in advance for your restraint." There was a pause, the collective kind, where people decide whether they're about to argue or perform. Wolfe, naturally, didn't allow either. "You are here," he said, "because a painting was stolen, recovered, and potentially switched. You are also here because the man who owned that painting is dead, and someone among you are acting through. You intended to alter that painting's value by altering its story." Susan Dart raised a hand. Wolfe ignored it. "The man who used the name Thomas Brodel," Wolfe continued, "visited Miss Costigan under false pretenses. He posed as an appraiser from Archangel Insurance. He also fabricated dinner invitations, false donations, and recorded multiple conversations without consent. These efforts were not designed to retrieve the painting, they were designed to create a narrative that the painting's provenance was flawed, that its value was questionable, and that its ownership could be legally challenged." Bostwick opened his mouth to object. Wolfe silenced him with a single finger raised. "Mr. Vonneck," Wolfe said, "has employed aliases in previous negotiations. He visited a legal archive under false identification. He attempted to find sealed records related to the Costigan recovery in 2018. He also offered the donation note left at the Metropolitan Opera. A note later matched to samples of his handwriting. I don't deny the alias," Vonneck said calmly, "but I wasn't alone in that. Half the people here have used proxies." "That standard, Wolfe said, is not synonymous with innocent." Delia spoke next. "You're saying Vonneck tried to remove the original document linking the painting to my uncle?" Wolfe nodded and succeeded, briefly, but not entirely. "The notarized transfer was duplicated and stored in my personal archive. What Mr. Vonneck took was the copy in the office file, an attempt to undermine the record's chain of custody." Baum sat forward. "You're suggesting this was a coordinated effort that requires funding, logistics, and incentive. Who gains the most?" Wolfe said. "We arrive at motive." He turned his gaze to Susan Dart. "Miss Dart," Wolfe said, "your foundation recently announced a new acquisition strategy. Privately, I understand. You have been seeking to recover undervalued pieces with disputed lineage ones. You could claim as restored, authentic originals. That's not a crime," she said. "No." Wolfe agreed, "but funding the obfuscation of a painting's legitimacy is." She bristled. "You have no proof." "No," Wolfe said again, "but I have logic." Mr. Bostwick appraised the original Costigan painting at $1.4 million. That appraisal was underwritten by Horizon Arts. Shortly after the appraisal, a grant was issued to a shell firm that later contacted Miss Costigan through an intermediary, Mr. Brodel. Bostwick shifted uncomfortably. "That's a coincidence. I appraise hundreds of pieces." "But you do not," Wolfe said. "Typically appraise pieces you've already declared recovered unless paid handsomely," which you were. I handed Wolfe the copy of the payment stub I'd obtained from Saul $40,000, wired from a holding company registered in Delaware. Mr. Baum, Wolfe said, turning at last. You prepared Merrill Costigan's will. You included a clause allowing the estate to renegotiate possession of the painting if its authenticity was ever legally challenged. That's standard, Baum said flatly. It is also exploitable, Wolfe replied, and it was placed there after the original recovery on the recommendation of Mr. Vonneck. Silence again. Delia, Wolfe said. They wanted you to panic, to doubt the painting's origin, to believe you needed arbitration, outside help. You didn't. The painting is real. The file is intact. The fraud has failed. She nodded slowly. Wolfe exhaled. This is not a courtroom. I am not a judge. But I have submitted a full account of these actions to Inspector Kramer. Names, dates, amounts, motives. Whether indictments follow is no longer my concern. But your reputations, such as they were, are now tethered to your intentions. Heroes rare and damning. You may go. And one by one, they did. Delia lingered, then followed. The others filed out, eyes averted. No arguments, no rebuttals. Only Vonneck looked back, just once. Before stepping through the door, when the office was finally empty, Wolfe sat again. Fritz brought his beer. I asked, why let them walk? Because, Wolfe said, I've already won. Wolfe doesn't measure victories the way most people do. He doesn't need applause, court orders, or front-page headlines when he says he's already won. What he means is, I know the truth, and now they know I know. And for Wolfe, that's enough, usually. But this time, I could tell it wasn't sitting as well as he wanted it to. The pieces fit. The manipulations were exposed. But there was something in his tone subtle, quiet, but there a sense of unfinished business. Like the case had ended cleanly on paper, but was still dripping somewhere under the floorboards. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast of poached eggs and black tea, Wolfe's version of a culinary shrug, I brought it up. You don't think it's over, I said. He didn't respond immediately. He buttered a roll with the careful precision of a surgeon prepping an incision. Then the conspiracy failed, but the architect remains unnamed. You mean Vonneck? Wolfe shook his head. Vonneck is an instrument. He's careful, ambitious, and self-serving. Yes, but he's not a strategist. Someone else initiated this. Someone with deeper pockets and a colder disposition. I leaned back. You think Susan Dart was a puppet, too? She was opportunistic. She joined, but didn't initiate. No, this began before her foundation. Got involved. It began with Costigan's revised will. I paused mid-bite. You think Costigan was manipulated into changing it? Possibly, Wolfe said. Or someone else added the clause through coercion or deception. That led us back to one person, Frederick Baum, the quiet attorney, always neutral, always exact. He'd sat through the office gathering without flinching, without defending or denying. At the time, it read like professional detachment, but in hindsight, it looked more like insulation. By noon, I was back in Midtown with Saul. He'd gotten eyes on Baum's movements over the last 3 weeks and something stuck out. Baum had met privately with a man named Claude Merriman, CEO of an art investment firm called Argent Holdings. Merriman wasn't on our radar before. He didn't show up in the Costigan estate, hadn't spoken publicly on the painting, and hadn't attended the office gathering. But Argent Holdings had recently made a quiet offer to Horizon Arts via an anonymous shell company to purchase 10 unreleased pieces from emerging artists. On paper, it looked like philanthropy, but the purchase order included a side clause: pending acquisition of supplemental assets currently under evaluation. The supplemental asset? You guessed it, the Costigan painting. Wolfe examined the files Saul brought in. It was all there. Merriman's firm creating shell subsidiaries, funding Horizon Arts, transferring funds to a consulting arm linked to Bostwick's appraisal service. Nothing illegal, but connected. He's the spider, Wolfe said, the one who doesn't enter the web. He weaves it. We sat in silence a moment. Wolfe finally murmured. He used Vonnegut to dig up old records. He used Dart and Bostwick to push valuation. And he had Baum plant the legal tripwire in the will. Also, he could engineer a public doubt, depress the painting's value, then acquire it through legal channels washed, sanitized, and profitable. The brilliance of it was in its subtlety. No forged documents, no theft, just a manipulation of truth, perception, and law. All the players had plausible deniability. Even if we laid it out, it wouldn't stick. Merriman was untouchable, or so. He thought. At Wolfe's request, I called Delia. She arrived that evening. Wolfe explained the full picture, Merriman's motives, his connections, and the way her uncle had been boxed in first by legal technicalities, then by orchestrated doubt. Delia listened, face still, hands folded. He killed my uncle, she asked softly. No, Wolfe said. But he strangled his reputation and positioned himself to harvest the remains. Delia nodded once. What do you need? That was Wolfe's cue. You still own the painting, he said, and you control its narrative. If you announce a temporary public exhibition, say, for charity, Merriman can't acquire it quietly. Its legitimacy will be reaffirmed in public view. And you can partner with a museum that has no stake in the fraud. She smiled faintly. You're saying we shine a light on it. I'm saying, Wolfe replied, we deny him the shadows he requires. She agreed. Within 2 days, the painting was transferred to the New York Art Museum for temporary display. A press release was drafted and distributed, stating the painting was indisputably verified through dual documentation, estate records, and archival confirmation from Nero Wolfe. The name carried weight. Merriman's silent hand couldn't protest without outing himself. The fake shell firm withdrew its offer to Horizon. Susan Dart resigned quietly from the board. Vonnegut stopped returning calls. Bostwick issued a general apology for conflating dates in his appraisal notes. Baum predictably went on vacation to France. Kramer showed up 3 days later, in plain clothes. No cigar. Hell of a mess, he said. But clean now. You didn't leave much room for indictments, but you salted the earth. Wolfe sipped his beer. A man doesn't always need to punish his enemies. Occasionally, it is sufficient to prevent their success. Kramer nodded once. then eyed me. "You're lucky he's on your side." "I know," I said. Later that evening, after Fritz had cleared the plates and the orchids had been watered, Wolfe spoke again. "Archie," he said, "that man Broddle, he may never surface again. But watch for the next one. You think this'll happen again?" "It always does," he replied, "when there is beauty and money. There will always be men who attempt to counterfeit both." Then he leaned back in his chair, reached for his book, and opened to a bookmarked page. The brownstone was quiet again. No guests, no wine glasses set for phantoms, just the soft scrape of a chair, the rustle of paper, and the distant hum of just as quiet, calm, and absolute, if the brownstone was ever going to return to normal. This was the week for it. The painting was on display behind museum glass. Delia Costigan had left for Philadelphia, having refused an offer for the painting from a private European collector. That came in suspiciously fast. Wolfe was back to his orchids. I was back to teasing Fritz about his perfectly symmetrical carrots. And the only people ringing our doorbell were delivery boys and a misplaced Jehovah's Witness, who apologized profusely after Wolfe quoted Ecclesiastes at him and slammed the door. But peace never lasts. Not here. Not in Wolfe's world, where intellect attracts chaos like perfume attracts bees. It started with a flower. Thursday morning, Fritz brought in the mail and handed Wolfe a small cream-colored envelope. No address, just the words, "For Mr. Wolfe." Personal inside, pressed between two sheets of parchment, was a single dried flower, a saxifraga tiled in silver saxifrage, native to alpine regions. Rare, difficult to cultivate. Wolfe held it like it was made of glass. He turned it over once, twice, then passed it to me. "No note?" I asked. He shook his head. "Fan mail from the mountain regions?" "No," Wolfe said. "A message? A threat?" "No," he said again. "A warning?" I raised an eyebrow. "From who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and made his way to the plant rooms. I followed, of course. Wolfe doesn't take strolls lightly. In the north greenhouse, he approached a shelf containing our own specimen of saxifraga. Fritz had nurtured it for years under exacting conditions: altitude simulation, artificial rock bed, UV-timed lighting. And there, tucked just behind the terracotta base, was something else. A small plastic USB drive, clear casing, no markings. "I did not place that there," Wolfe said calmly. "No kidding." We returned to the office. I slotted the drive into my laptop with one hand on the keyboard, and the other not far from the desk drawer where I kept a .38 just in case files started exploding. The drive contained a single audio file, time-stamped from the week before. It was a recording of a phone call. Wolfe's voice was on it, clear as day. My voice, too. It was the conversation we'd had in the office. The day I told him about the missing document, the exact exchange. Every word. Someone had been listening, not through the phones. In the house, I looked up at Wolfe. "Bugs?" "No," he said. "That room is swept weekly. If this was captured, it was not through traditional means. You think someone got inside. Someone has been inside," he replied, and has not left. That turned the air cold. He called Fritz, perform an inventory of all food, drink, and storage rooms. Look for anything unfamiliar. Archie, check the attic and service access points. Leave no space unexamined. It took 2 hours, but we found it. In the wine cellar, tucked behind a rack labeled Riesling. Austrian 1974 was a narrow fiber optic microphone threaded between 2 bottles. It was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, and we were. It had a tiny wireless transmitter taped to the back of the shelf, connected to a battery pack embedded in what looked like a corked bottle of vinegar. "Well, I'll be damned," I said. "They bugged our wine." Wolfe didn't speak. He removed the entire section of the rack, had Fritz clean the area, and instructed me to box the device for Kramer. With a note, courtesy of Thomas Brodel, now unemployed. But that wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the flower. That was personal. Someone had to know Wolfe's botanical preferences, know how rare that species was, and know how to use it as a signature silent, elegant, intrusive. The dried statement it had been selected, preserved, and carried deliberately, not a threat, but a flag. We were here. We're still here. That night, Wolfe didn't eat dinner. That's rare. Fritz offered quail in saffron. Wolfe waved it away. He sat in his chair, beer untouched, eyes fixed on the windows. Not the television, not a book, the windows. "They are still watching," he muttered. "Who?" I asked. "Merriman," he said. "You think he planted the device?" "No," Wolfe said. "He wouldn't sully his gloves. He has people for that. Quiet people." I paced the room. "So, what's the point of leaving the recording now? The game's already up. It's not about the painting anymore." Wolfe said, "It's about deterrence. They want to leave an impression, not a case, a calling card." Exactly. The next morning, Saul arrived with an update. He had tailed Baum's paralegal, who had made a trip to a high-end print shop in Soho known for creating forged archival documents for movies, stage plays, and, occasionally, people with money and bad intentions. The paralegal left with a small tube, later delivered to a midtown hotel under a pseudonym, Mr. Brodel. Saul had intercepted the delivery slip. Wolfe nodded. So they had a backup plan in place. A fabricated transfer document, in case we didn't have ours. But we did, and that ruined their second act, Wolfe said. "Then why not just walk away?" "Because they fear I may continue," Wolfe said, "and they want to warn me softly." Wolfe instructed me to write a letter, short, precise, formal, addressed to Claude Merriman, Argent Holdings. It read, "Mr. Merriman, I have no interest in your further endeavors, provided you demonstrate the wisdom not to revisit mine. The painting is secure. The narrative is sealed. Do not step again into my shade. Nero Wolfe." The letter was hand-delivered by Fritz himself. No messenger. No email. 2 days later, a white envelope arrived. No flower. No usp. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. Double quotes. Understood. Consider the matter concluded. CM. And with that, the silence returned. No more guests. No more invitations. No more Brodel. Just the regular smells of Fritz's cooking, the rustle of orchid petals, and the soft click of Wolfe's pen as he returned to his crossword puzzles. The dinner guest who never arrived had left behind more than an empty chair. He'd left a ripple, a silence so deliberate it felt louder than a gunshot. But Wolfe, as always, had prevailed. It was 2 weeks after the envelope with Claude Merriman's terse reply landed on Wolfe's desk. The house had gone quiet again, the real kind this time. No letters slipped under the door, no cryptic flowers, no phantoms playing audio files back to us like ghostly dictation machines. Just Fritz humming softly in the kitchen, and the whir of Wolfe's orchids breathing under artificial sun. Wolfe had returned to schedule. That meant breakfast at 9, orchids from 10 to 11, lunch at 1, and absolutely no discussion of anything resembling criminal intrigue after dinner. To a civilian, that would look like business as usual. But I knew better. Wolfe hadn't been himself, not entirely. Oh, he ate well, slept fine, and insulted my grammar with perfect rhythm, but the spark, that little gleam of smug satisfaction he usually gets when he's outplayed a boardroom full of vipers, hadn't returned. And I knew why. We'd shut down the conspiracy, exposed the actors, protected the painting. But Wolfe hadn't gotten what he really wanted. He hadn't gotten the architect. Claude Merriman had remained behind his mirrored glass walls and executive gatekeepers. The note he'd sent was an olive branch dipped in acid. Understood. Consider. The matter concluded. Translation: I won't touch you, Wolfe, if you don't touch me. And Wolfe had accepted that publicly, but privately, he was still rolling the stone over in his mind, checking for cracks. It was a Thursday again when it finally happened. Around 3 in the afternoon, just as Wolfe was finishing his coffee and preparing to endure the existence of a new gardening magazine Theo had left on his desk, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later, a man in a grey wool coat stepped into the office with the posture of someone who had either nothing to lose or everything to gain. He looked mid-40s, clean-shaven and unhurried. Name's Everett Glenn, he said to me. I was told to ask for Mr. Wolfe. He's here, I said. And listening, Glenn turned to Wolfe. I was employed by Mr. Claude Merriman until 2 days ago. That got Wolfe's attention. He gestured to the guest chair. Sit, Glenn did. Without hesitation, I handled security operations for Merriman's non-public assets. Off-the-books logistics, retrieval, acquisitions. Not theft, he added, just course correction. I waited for Wolfe to react, but he didn't blink. You're here because your course was corrected. I'm here, Glenn said, because I found out Merriman made an agreement with you behind my back. That he pulled out of the Costigan situation without consulting the people he put in motion. Wolfe exhaled softly. You're angry. I'm practical, Glenn said. When a man leaves his team in the lurch, that team starts asking questions. And what I found didn't sit right. He reached into his coat slowly and produced a file folder. Inside were copies of internal memos, wire transfers, shell company authorizations, and one very damning item, a project brief from Merriman himself titled Operation Clifftop. Costigan Artifact Devaluation Strategy. Wolfe flipped through the pages with slow precision. "Why are you giving this to me?" Glenn looked at me, then back at Wolfe. "Because you're the only one who didn't bite." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "I was not offered a bribe." "No," Glenn said. "You were tested. The invitations, the no-shows. The audio leaks. It was Merriman's way of measuring your tolerance. If you hadn't pushed back, he would have used your name to validate the sale. Not with consent, just implication." Wolfe's voice dropped. "He intended to invoke my authority posthumously." Glenn nodded. "In so many words, yes. That explained it. All of it. The orchestration wasn't just about confusing Delia or neutralizing evidence. It was about dragging Wolfe's name into the mud. By inference, if not outright forgery. Wolfe had always feared being used by a fool. This was worse. This was a strategist. One who thought Wolfe could be leveraged like a chess piece if not through cooperation, then through omission. Glenn stood. "I want nothing further to do with Merriman. But if you intend to burn him, I'd like to watch." Wolfe nodded once. "Leave the documents. Do not return." When Glenn was gone, Wolfe spoke without looking at me. "You may call Lon Cohen. Message? Tell him I have documents that implicate Claude Merriman in a campaign to defraud art institutions through falsified narratives and manipulated asset histories. Tell him they are authentic. Tell him I'm not interested in anonymity." I picked up the phone before he finished. Lon didn't hesitate. "You're going on the record." "I'm giving you the record," I said. "Wolfe wants it read." And just like that, Wolfe had reset the board. By Friday morning, the Gazette ran the headline, "Elite investor linked to art devaluation plot. Private detective breaks silence." The article didn't use the word criminal, but it didn't have to. It described Merriman's web of shell companies, his use of proxy appraisers, his attempts to devalue a historic painting for personal gain. It quoted Wolfe, "When the appetite for profit eclipses the appetite for truth, the artwork becomes irrelevant. It is only a carcass on which greed feeds." Merriman released a vague denial. Then he resigned from Argent Holdings. Quietly, the market noticed. His name vanished from several boards within 72 hours. Delia called from Philadelphia. "He's finished, isn't he?" "Yes," I said. "And Wolfe?" I looked across the office. Wolfe was reading. Peaceful. Finally. He's had dessert. And that's the thing about Wolfe. He doesn't care about jail cells or subpoenas. His justice is intellectual. It's precise. He doesn't want revenge. He wants removal, not punishment, but prevention. That evening, Wolfe and I sat in silence as Fritz served roast squaw with truffle butter. The chair across from Wolfe was empty, as always. "Archie," Wolfe said, "do you remember what I told you after the first invitation? That Broddle would come again, not in person, but in consequence." He nodded. And he did. I raised my glass to Broddle, who never came, and who told us everything anyway. Wolfe clinked his with mine. Just once. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the brownstone was still. The dinner guest had disappeared. Yes, but in doing so, he'd revealed every hidden seat at the table. And Wolfe, immovable, unblinking, uninvited, had dined just the same. In the weeks that followed, Life at the brownstone fell back into place with an almost suspicious calm. The mail came in unmarked and unscented. Fritz's soffles rose to appropriate heights. Kramer didn't call. Merriman didn't write. And no more botanically laced threats arrived tucked between our geraniums. Delia Costigan sent a postcard from Paris, where the museum had invited her to speak about the provenance of the painting and her uncle's legacy. She wrote Wolfe a single sentence. He would have admired your restraint. Wolfe read it aloud once, and then tucked it inside a gardening journal like it belonged there. Saul reported that Merriman had moved quietly into a consultancy role for a hedge fund. Operating out of Zurich, Von Eck had transitioned into private. Arbitration work still in the legal shadows, but without the reach he once had. Susan Dart had gone fully underground, issuing a blanket sabbatical announcement through Horizon Arts. Bostwick, last I checked, he was giving lectures on narrative ambiguity in appraisal. Wolfe declined to attend and a painting evening reclamation, Costigan's mysterious, brooding oil on canvas with its layered shadows and strange depth now, hung inside a sealed glass vault at the New York Art Museum. Credited fully to Merrill Costigan with an added plaque, verified by estate, documentation, and external review. Nero Wolfe, consultant. Which brings us to the final irony. Wolfe never saw the painting again. Not in person. You're not going? I asked one Saturday, as I tucked in my shirt and prepared to attend the public opening. Wolfe didn't look up from his orchid journal. I have seen it before. Not. In the museum, the frame does not change the brushstroke, he said. Come on. It's the capstone to the whole case. No, Wolfe replied, setting down the journal. The conclusion was not the painting's fate, Archie. It was the fact that it was no longer a tool for deceit. That is enough. And that was Wolfe in a sentence. He didn't need to celebrate victory. He just needed to know the truth was no longer being dressed up in costume. And passed off at market value. Later that night, we sat on opposite sides of the dining table, two empty place settings between us. Fritz brought out mushroom ragout with saffron rice, and for dessert, a slice of pear tart soaked in brandy. You know, I said, this whole mess started with a man who never showed up. Wolfe chewed, swallowed, and dabbed his mouth. He showed up, Wolfe said. He simply didn't use the door. I raised a glass to Broddle, to absence. Wolfe corrected, properly observed. It is louder than presence. I laughed. That's poetic for you. No, he said. It is factual. I leaned back, watching him for a moment, thinking of all the unseen hands behind the curtain, the signatures that never matched, the dinners that were invitations to war. The real crime hadn't been theft, or even deception. It had been the attempt to erase a life, a provenance, a legacy, and almost Wolfe himself. But they'd failed because Wolfe noticed silence. He measured what wasn't there. He spotted the outline of a missing chair and filled in the man who should have sat in it. And in doing so, he'd pulled the string that unraveled everything. Wolfe finished his beer and signaled for another. I poured it myself, and somewhere out there, I imagined Thomas Broddle, if he ever really existed, wandering through someone else's fiction. Already forgotten, but not by us.